Did you miss me? I'm back sitting in the same chair, but I've angled myself a little bit this way so the background looks more interesting. Funnily enough, this video isn't actually about my setup. This video is about one of my favorite ancient cultures that I think is really underrated and that I love talking about. It's the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians were a group of people who lived a really long time ago, and I'm in love with literally all of them. And I feel like as a culture, as a people, they kind of get brushed over because they weren't necessarily a really strong military force at all. We talk about ancient Greece all the time, we talk about ancient Rome, but we don't really talk about the fact that the Phoenicians had a really big impact on the continuation of those societies. So the Phoenicians were a predominantly seafaring people who completely revitalized trade during the early Iron Age periods of the Mediterranean. And unfortunately, not a lot of their archaeological evidence has survived throughout the Levant's tumultuous history, but we do have a lot of evidence on how they impacted Greek material culture because their interactions with the ancient Greeks were really important for the growth of ancient Greek society. So in Greece, after the Bronze Age collapse, ancient Greece kind of went through a bit of a dark ages, and we don't have a lot of material record to kind of see what the ancient Greeks were doing during this time. And I believe it was really the Phoenicians that dragged the Greeks out of the dark ages and contributed a lot to what we now think of ancient Greek culture. But yeah, I'm just kind of relating it to ancient Greece because that's my specialty, but let's talk a little bit about the Phoenicians as their own unit first. The Phoenicians were people who occupied the historical Levant, which is now most of modern-day Syria, Lebanon, and northern Israel. During the early Iron Age, the Phoenicians were absolutely the greatest force of influence over the whole Mediterranean. But compared to their neighbors like the Syrians and the Canaanites, they were really, really different when it came to their ideological practices. They never tried to create a unified empire or kingdom. The Phoenicians kind of existed as a lot of small city-states, which kind of just existed around the Levant, as opposed to trying to kind of band together and unify all of them under one rule. They kind of were independently operated. Feels like they were a little bit more chill than maybe a lot of other Mediterranean powers at the time who were always striving for imperialism. Despite the fact that they weren't completely unified, they all shared the same language, script, and manufacturing techniques. So they had their own culture that was very preeminent. So what were the goods that they made? Oh, dude, they were literally so good. They were literally so good. Everyone wanted something that the Phoenicians had made. Those babies mastered their craft. They mastered the shit out of it. If you had Phoenician shit, you were cool. They were really skilled in wood, ivory, and metalworking, as well as textile production, which very much solidified their presence in the Mediterranean from 1000 to 600 BCE. But above anything else, above them being really skilled craftsmen, they were expert traders, and that is really what the Phoenicians are known for today. And the 10th century BC was an incredibly, incredibly important time for Phoenicia, especially in trade. Okay, so you know how I said Phoenicia was essentially made up of these sort of independently self-governed city-states? Well, before the 10th century BC, these city-states remained relatively separate from each other. However, when the ruler of Tyre, Hiram I, came to power, he was able to unite the coastal cities of Phoenicia as a commercial powerhouse. So politically, the city-states remained independent and self-governed. Under Hiram I, Phoenicia became this absolute bombshell of trading. It established itself in the field of overseas commercial travel in a way that no other civilization in the Mediterranean had done ever before. Hiram completely revitalized Phoenicia and had organized its commercial policy by the end of the 9th century BCE. He was an entrepreneur. When we're saying trade in the ancient world, this is 900 BCE. How far does that span? I'm so glad you asked. You always ask the best fucking questions. Phoenician trade routes spanned the majority of Europe, to the Greeks, the Greek islands, across southern Europe, and up to ancient Britain. Bitch, they were going everywhere. They also had influence on places like Arabia and India, which they accessed by way of the Red Sea. Their primary exports were wood, textiles, glass, all of which was very skillfully created art. So in the ancient world, around 1000 BC, which is 3000 years ago, the Levant was really abundant with forests of cedar and fir, which had been harnessed for trade since the beginning of recorded history in that area. And the Phoenicians did this too. They really took use of the forests and they were like, shit, we can make money with this. People want this. Give the people what they want. The people want deforestation. The nice smell of the cedar trees was a really big selling point for the Phoenicians. 1000 BC, they don't have the level of distance from nature that we do. And a lot of times there are things in nature that don't smell great. I'm thinking especially rotting dead bodies. They used to have those just kind of sitting around. So there's lots of reasons you might need something to smell good in ancient times. The Phoenicians were like, cedar smells good. Phoenician textiles were also really, really popular. I've mentioned that a little bit already. And they were quite beautiful rarity in ancient times because they incorporated the use of Tyrian purple. And this was a dye that was made from shellfish local to Phoenicia. And it was really rare and quite hard to extract. And so if you had something that was made with this Tyrian purple dye, bitch, okay. The dye brought them a lot of fame during the 7th and 8th centuries BCE. It was so popular that there have been like great deposits of shells that were used to make the dye that have been uncovered and found on the outskirts of Sidon and Tyre, which were big cities of Phoenicia. The species of shellfish which was used to make this dye was basically driven to extinction because of the way that they were overusing it to make the dye because it was so popular. Glass is another thing that the Phoenicians traded like crazy because they kind of perfected the technique known as glass blowing. Kind of like inflate molten glass into a sort of bubble with a blowpipe, and then it looks really pretty. It's still done today. And while it is seen before the Phoenicians are around, it is said that they kind of solidified this practice and they were really one of the first to perfect it. I wasn't there. That's just what people say. The Egyptians did actually do this before them, but the Phoenicians used semi-transparent glass, which the Egyptians did not do. And they would create elaborate jewelry and perfume bottles in really vibrant colors. If we think about cultures in antiquity and just even in modern history, I feel like the relationship between Phoenicia and Greece is one that I really like and I really think is interesting politically to dissect. Because at first, Greece was a really valuable trade relation for Phoenicia, but over time it became a really mutually beneficial relationship. A lot of Phoenicians would kind of migrate to Greece and sell their crafts. Phoenicia was never really interested in expanding and they had no desire to claim any Greek territory. They were a relatively peaceful group of people throughout their entire time in the Levant. The two were never threatened by each other and their craftsmanship became really influential to the Greeks. If you look at Greek art in this period, it's called the Orientalizing period in Greece, and this is because they're getting a lot of motifs and style coming in from the East, and this is greatly in part due to the Phoenicians who established their craftsmanship in Greece and they brought a whole lot of the Eastern style over to Greece. Now, this is where shit gets really interesting because not only were the Phoenicians influential in their style and art, they were really, really influential to the Greeks in a huge way in terms of language. So remember how I said earlier how the Greeks kind of had that Dark Ages period and I feel like the Phoenicians really pulled them out of that? This is kind of why. During the Dark Ages of ancient Greece, we don't really have any evidence of language. In the Bronze Age, we have evidence of the Linear B script, which is known to us as the earliest form of Greek. But then after the Bronze Age collapse, you all of a sudden see no writing anymore in Greek archaeological record, which is a little bit concerning because language is a really important part of a civilization and a culture. However, around the 7th century BCE, we see the use of the Phoenician alphabet being used to depict the Greek language. So it's like I can use the English alphabet, but I can write in Italian in the English alphabet and vice versa. So the Greeks were using the Phoenician alphabet, but they were writing in Greek. And a piece of evidence we have for this is on a clay skyphos called Nestor's cup. This is a cup which is inscribed in the Phoenician alphabet, but with Greek words. On Nestor's cup is inscribed the name of its owner and the name of the Greek goddess of beauty, Aphrodite. The script is written in the early West Greek alphabet, which was directly borrowed from Phoenicia. It has been dated to around 750 to 700 BCE, which gives us like the latest possible time that the Phoenician alphabet begins to influence the Greek world. Greeks borrowed the Phoenician alphabet. They changed it a little bit. Like this chart I love because you can just see the progression of the Phoenician alphabet keep going. So you see the Greeks take the Phoenician alphabet, they change it a little bit and they use it to write in Greek, and then you get that alphabet essentially become the Latin alphabet and become the alphabet that we use today. So it all started with the Phoenician alphabet, and the evolution of that is the English alphabet that we use now. What? Isn't that crazy? Of course, I think it's hard to talk about Phoenicia without talking about one of my favorite cities of all time, Carthage. Shit slaps. Carthage was one of the most incredible and important trading hubs in all of the Mediterranean. The Phoenicians would go around, they'd create colonies in lots of different places so that they could go and trade there. So they'd like put up their little trading post so that they could establish trade in that area. And Carthage was perhaps their most successful endeavor. Based in what is now Tunisia, Carthage was essentially placed there to influence and control ships passing through Sicily and like the North African coast. If you're thinking about the Mediterranean world, that's almost like the gateway. Like the Phoenicians kind of covered all of the Eastern Mediterranean. They were on top of that shit. But if you think about like how you're going to get to the western side of the Mediterranean, like that little strip between Sicily and Carthage, or it's now Tunisia, they got that shit on lockdown. So now any ship that needs to go through there is going to be influenced by the Phoenicians' trade. Anyway, it kind of took on a life of its own, as I'm sure you might be aware. I'm not going to assume any knowledge. Sort of outgrew the Phoenicians and eventually became like a Roman rival. So what happened to the Phoenicians? If they were such an incredible powerhouse in trade and they were able to sustain themselves for so long, what happened to them? Well, obviously no one culture can last forever. But I will tell you what happened to them. Essentially, because the Phoenicians hadn't had this kind of unifying rule and because they barely had much military presence, as the empires around them began to rise, they weren't really able to keep up with the imperialization that was going on all around them. It first kind of started with the Assyrian conquest of Phoenicia, which was around like the 700s BCE. The Assyrians kind of annexed Phoenicia, but the like main cities Tyre and Byblos were able to remain outside of Assyrian control. Then in 539 BCE, Cyrus the Great, you may know him from being the founder of the Persian Empire, he took Babylon. It's kind of a whole thing. And then he kind of started to contemplate the rest of the East. And the Phoenicians kind of decided to yield themselves to the Persians because, like I said, they didn't have a very strong military force. They weren't going to risk shit. And then most of the Levant was kind of consolidated under Cyrus into a single province. Still, Phoenicia was allowed a little bit of autonomy. Like the Phoenician kings were able to remain in power and they were given the same rights actually as like Persian governors. So the Phoenicians actually remained quite an important part of the Achaemenid Empire because they were so good at trade and maritime stuff. And during the Greco-Persian Wars, the Phoenicians did actually like build the fleets used to attack Greece. So there goes that little symbiotic friendship. I don't believe in love anymore. And I guess the Greeks held a grudge because Phoenicia was one of the first areas to be conquered by Alexander the Great. He went straight for Tyre, which is technically now a Persian city-state. He besieged Tyre for like 7 months and it was really difficult. But the rest of Phoenicia kind of surrendered really easily. Alexander the Great's policy was that of like Hellenization, which meant that once he colonized a place, they all had to act Greek. The Hellenic culture, religion, language was all pushed upon the people that were colonized. Despite this, though, the Phoenician city-states retained native names, and Greek administration and settlement was quite limited in these areas. So they were still kind of doing their thing, but they had been conquered by like the Assyrians and then the Persians and now the Greeks. So little by little, their culture's kind of just getting suppressed. And after Alexander the Great dies, everything gets split up and really confusing. But in 62 BCE, the Romans intervened and just conquered the whole territory because that's kind of what they like to do. And the territory was incorporated into the Roman province of Syria. So essentially after the Roman invasion, whatever like political or cultural autonomy the Phoenicians had left was like basically completely dissolved. And the region was Romanized. And they ruled up until about 640 CE, which is when the Muslim Arabs invaded the territory and the region was Islamicized. And that's kind of the story. Essentially, in antiquity, Phoenicia was a really, really important part of the Mediterranean and the greater European world. It was an absolute powerhouse in trade and seafaring and brought a lot of places out of the really dark ages after the Bronze Age collapse. There was a power vacuum after the Bronze Age collapse because a lot of huge civilizations just simultaneously collapsed and Phoenicia was left standing and was really able to build itself up. And after doing that, it didn't invade and it didn't build a huge army and it didn't take over the world. It actually brought other civilizations out of the dark ages and traded with them and grew their economies. Because we don't have a lot of indigenous writings because of how many times it switched hands, and Phoenicia is a little bit of a mystery to us and it has been a lot in the past. So that's why people don't really know about it. People don't really talk about it, but we do know a lot about it now that we didn't before thanks to evidence from other parts of the Mediterranean. Anyway, that's just a little look into one of my favorite historical civilizations. I think the Phoenicians were cool. If you know anything else about them that you would like to talk about, you can talk about it. I don't know. I'm done. All right. The rest is up to you. I did my part. Yeah, let me know what you think and let me know if Alexander the Great was based or not. Personally, I think no. Okay, bye.